Clipper Audiobooks presents A Short History of the World According to Sheep by Sally Coulthard, narrated by Karen Cass. Chapter 1. What have sheep ever done for us? On the face of it, they're just white noise in the countryside, slowly chewing the cud while we get on with our hurried lives. We sometimes notice them, come the Easter sweetness of springtime lambs, but for most of the year they're invisible. And yet, of any animal that has lived on this planet, sheep have shaped the course of human history, from Viking warriors to Renaissance painters, Iron Age sacrifices to the rolling hills and bo-peep imagery of ye olde England. Sheep have been central to the human story. They've fed us, clothed us, changed our diet, made us both richer and poorer, altered our landscape, helped build great civilizations and win wars, decorated our homes, allowed us to create artistic treasures, and financed pioneers and privateers to conquer large swathes of the earth. Vast fortunes have been built on the backs of sheep, and cities shaped by shepherds' markets and meat trading. But to begin the story, we must travel back to the dawn of farming, that moment in time when our spear-throwing ancestors shifted from chasing and hunting prey to raising their own animals. Between 10 and 20 million years ago, sheep's earliest ancestor evolved in the freezing mountains of Central Asia. During the last ice age, these tough, high-altitude creatures began to move outwards. Some trotted westward, towards Europe, others eastward into Siberia. Some even made it as far as North America, crossing the frozen Bering Strait around 750,000 years ago. The breed that gave us all modern domesticated sheep was the one that headed west, the Asiatic mouflon, a dark-coloured, hairy beast with a soft, woolly undercoat. Unlike the sheep you find on today's farms, these archaic ovines had large horns and, instead of needing to be sheared, naturally molted every year. The one thing they did have in common with modern sheep, however, is that they were delicious. From the moment our prehistoric ancestors clapped eyes on wild sheep, we consistently and energetically hunted them for food. And then something happened. Around 11,000 years ago, hunter-gatherers turned their attention towards growing stuff. At a number of sites across a wide, curving area that has become known as the Fertile Crescent, which stretches across the Middle East from Egypt through to the Persian Gulf, we find that people are starting to cultivate cereals and pulses and, crucially, rearing their own animals. Humans start to keep sheep. Quite why they did this, we don't know. Maybe we overhunted or overexploited our wild resources. Perhaps the fluctuating climate allowed us to grow crops that previously wouldn't take. Maybe the way we organised ourselves socially changed, or population numbers increased, or we suddenly had an abundance of resources that allowed us the freedom to experiment with farming. It's a puzzle, but what is becoming clear from the archaeology is that different groups of people, totally unconnected, started tinkering with farming at around the same time. One of the earliest places this happened was a small village in central Turkey. The site of Arshikli Hoyuk had intrigued archaeologists for years, and had long been suspected of being important in the story of farming. This hunch was proved right in 2014 when the bones of hundreds of different animals were discovered. A team led by zoo archaeologist Mary Steiner of the University of Arizona in Tucson uncovered archaeological layers filled with the rubbish and remains of human occupation between 10,500 and 9,500 years ago. Sifting through the debris, it became clear that what the villagers were eating over time had changed dramatically. For the first 500 years, the men, women and children of the settlement feasted on wild fish, hares, tortoises, deer, and a number of wild sheep. For the next 500 years, however, the proportion of ovine bones steadily rises until, by 9,500 years ago, nearly all the remains come from sheep. Analysis of ancient sheep pee, which leaves behind salt traces, also showed how quickly sheep came to dominate the village. Over the relatively short 1,000-year period that Arshikli Hoyuk was occupied, people shifted from hunting wild sheep to then keeping just a few tethered up in the narrow alleyways between the mud houses, to finally large-scale management of sheep in pens on the edge of the village. Sheep farming had arrived. Although when is often the first question we ask about our switch from hunting and gathering to farming, the more interesting question is perhaps how. The relationship between sheep and humans isn't one of mutual symbiosis, the beautiful harmony that exists, say, between man and dog. Sheep don't need us, and yet we've somehow persuaded them to stay. One idea is that the dog should take credit. In the wild, wolves have been seen herding caribou as part of their hunting strategy, and it's been suggested that an enterprising Stone Age individual saw this natural sheepdog instinct and used it to their own advantage. Perhaps our ancient ancestors realized that, with the help of a canine companion, wild sheep could be herded and managed without too much effort, turning a feral food resource into a controlled flock. It's true that people started to keep pets some years before they started to domesticate livestock. One lovely example in northern Jordan, a 16,500-year-old grave at Uyan al-Hammam, uncovered a man deliberately buried with his red, presumably tame, fox. But training a wild dog to round up wild sheep would have been chaotic if not impossible. The days of one man and his dog were still some way off. If anything, as we'll see later in the book, sheep helped to domesticate dogs. It's much easier to domesticate an animal if you can catch it young. Many theories about how sheep were domesticated have centred on the idea of hunter-gatherers bringing wild lambs back to their camps as pets for their children, or to fatten up for later. You can imagine the scenario. A wild ewe has been killed in a hunt, leaving behind a tiny lamb. Hunter-gatherer decides to pick up the lamb and bring it back to the camp. There, it can be looked after by the family and either kept for milk or eaten at a later date. It makes sense on the face of it, but there's an issue with weaning. Any lamb that was old enough to survive by grazing, rather than its mother's milk, was probably nearly full size and not the easiest candidate for a grab and run. Life would be immeasurably easier if you could get a very young lamb and imprint it on a human. That way it would form such a close attachment to a person that they could control its every move. The only way to do this would be to take a lamb from its mother as soon as it was born and breastfeed it. And so, astonishingly, the history of sheep may indeed start with a woman nursing a newborn lamb. Far from this being a strange, repugnant idea, anthropology finds modern-day parallels in places such as New Guinea, where young piglets are taken in and nursed alongside children to become part of the family group. Historically, women across cultures have been encouraged to breastfeed young animals for many different reasons, not just for the animal's benefit, including to promote lactation, harden the nipples, and prevent conception. Indeed, when Mary Wollstonecraft, 18th century writer and feminist philosopher, was dying of sepsis following the birth of her daughter, Mary Shelley, who went on to write Frankenstein, the postpartum doctor insisted that puppies be brought in to suckle on her breasts and encourage Mary's body to expel the infected placenta. It didn't work, incidentally, and she died shortly afterwards. As recently as 2005, the story of a 40-year-old woman, Coulthard, who was discovered to be breastfeeding a Bengal tiger cub at Yangon Zoological Gardens in Burma, became headline news. But it's one thing to own a pet lamb, and another to start actively keeping and breeding sheep as a source of meat, milk, hides and wool. Neolithic farmers somehow began the journey of turning wild sheep into docile farm animals, ones that would breed in captivity and accept being handled, milked and sheared. We can only guess at the process. As any conservation zoo will tell you, not all animals will breed happily in captivity. From cheetahs to white rhinos, any number of factors, such as stress or mate preference, can stop wild animals from breeding if they're not in their natural habitat. Wild sheep must have coped, or at least enough of them must have done, with the demands of breeding in front of a human audience. Those that didn't died out. Sheep had a head start, however, because, down to a quirk of fate, they just happened to be an ideal animal to domesticate. Evolutionary physiologist Yared Diamond came up with a brilliant checklist of 6 traits that animals must exhibit if they're going to pass the domestication test with flying colours. Lots of animals have some of the traits, but very few have all 6. Sheep, however, tick all the boxes. The first checkbox is that the animal can't be too much of a picky eater. They need to be flexible and modest in their eating habits, i.e. to cope with varied grazing or eat more than just one type of foodstuff. The second checkbox is that they need to mature quickly so humans don't have to invest years looking after something before it can be eaten or put to some use. The third checkbox is, as we already noted, that an animal must be able to cope with being bred in captivity. The fourth is that the creature needs to be docile by nature, although sheep can be aggressive, especially rams during the breeding season. The fifth is that an animal can't be too panicky. Deer and gazelle, for example, will often die from shock if captured. And lastly, that a domesticated animal needs to have a social structure that includes a strong leader. This allows groups of animals to be controlled either by a human taking the position of pack leader, i.e. a shepherd, or training a dominant animal to lead the flock, i.e. a bellwether sheep. There's another trait sheep have that made them attractive to early farmers. Some breeds of wild or feral sheep have a distinct sense of place, a strong tendency to stick to their own home range. This natural instinct has been encouraged over thousands of years to become a shepherding practice known as hefting. The sheep are so imprinted on a particular area that shepherds can let their flocks graze without fences, hedges, or constant rounding up. The sheep get to know where the boundaries of their home range are, where the grass is particularly good, and where to find shelter. And this information is passed from ewe to lamb over successive generations. Hefted flocks also seem to become resistant to particular parasites, toxic plants and mineral deficiencies. Beatrix Potter's favourite sheep, the Herdwick of the Lake District, are perhaps the most famous of all hefted breeds. Beyond any natural predispositions that made sheep ripe for domestication, we have to assume that early farmers started to select certain characteristics in sheep that made them easier to control. Traits such as submissiveness would have been welcomed, while sheep that showed high levels of aggression would have been first for the chop. Sheep that were too large to handle or had horns may have been bred out of the population for being too tricky to manage, and mutations, such as a white fleece, which is easier to dye, selected and bred into the gene pool. Quite how intentional and rapid this process was, we don't know. Modern sheep vary hugely in size, fleece, colour, whether they have horns and so on, and not all of these characteristics may have been deliberate. However, what we can guess is that wild sheep may have changed into more placid, manageable animals much more quickly than you'd think. Back in 1959, Soviet scientists began an experiment to see if they could domesticate wild silver foxes, to see what happens to the biology and genetics of an animal as it becomes tame. Every generation, the scientists selected and bred from the few foxes that showed friendliness and a lack of aggression. 50 years and 50 generations of foxes later, the experiment showed 2 remarkable things. 1, that it was possible, in a relatively short frame of time, to take a wild animal and turn it into a domesticated one, not through training, but by picking out the tamest offspring, and 2, that the tame animals actually looked different from their wild ancestors. The genes that were linked with lack of aggression in the foxes also expressed themselves in physical ways. The tame foxes had a cluster of ancillary or accidental traits, such as floppy ears, a shorter nose, white fur spots, and a curly tail. In other words, a byproduct of domestication was a raft of new physical traits. It's not impossible that this could have been the mechanism by which some of the characteristics we see in modern sheep came about. DNA analysis has also shown that some of the differences we see between sheep breeds may also be down to responses to climatic changes, as sheep were moved between countries with different terrains and climates. Smaller body size, fleece thickness, and other traits may have evolved in response to environmental factors such as humidity or temperature, and not as a result of intensive and intentional breeding. Whatever the process, we now have a world with around 1 billion sheep. In this vast global flock, we have at least 1,000 breeds and crossbreeds of sheep across the planet, from the huge fluffy-wooled merinos to tiny tough ouessants. Sheep live on every continent apart from Antarctica and have adapted to diverse terrains from the freezing mountain ranges of Alaska to the scorching heat of the Sudan desert. Sheep also provide not just meat, but milk, cheese, lanolin, sheepskin, and perhaps most importantly, wool. Sheep have colonized the world so successfully and show such great variety of breeds, it makes you wonder just how they did it. Piecing together what we can, from both archaeological remains and DNA analysis, it looks as if there were a number of waves of sheep migrations out of the Fertile Crescent. The first wave, the pioneers, may have been domesticated sheep, but they didn't look much different from their wild cousins. They were smaller but still tough, horned creatures with mostly dark, hairy coats. Around 7,000 years ago, these ancient sheep gradually spread across prehistoric Europe, Asia, and into North Africa through trade, migration, and contact between different cultures. Descendants of these ovine pioneers still cling on in remote, inaccessible places and have avoided being interbred or replaced by new, improved breeds. If you want to know what a prehistoric sheep looks like, the European mouflon, which survives in pockets of Sardinia, Corsica, and Cyprus, provides a snapshot into the past, as do the sheep which ended up on the wind-swept peripheral fringes of northern Europe, the Soay, the Hebridean, Orkney, Icelandic, and Nordic breeds. These first domesticated sheep weren't particularly useful for their wool. Their coats consisted of thick, coarse hair with only a short undercoat of fine wool, perfect for cool mountain conditions. Every year, these ancient sheep would have molted. Early farmers may have collected the clumps of hair and wool, or even learned to pluck them from the sheep in a process called ruing. But we don't know what they did with the material. The hair would have been brittle, difficult to dye, and almost certainly too scratchy to make into clothing, although the softer wool, if you could get any, would have been workable. Meat was the order of the day for these early flocks, and milk soon starts to become a useful secondary product. Scientists recently found what some claim are the remains of the world's oldest cheese, the vestiges of a feta-like sheep's cheese on shards of Croatian pottery dated to 5,300 BC. By 5000 BC, farming had become the main system of food production for a huge swathe of people from West and Central Asia, North Africa, and the Mediterranean to Britain, Ireland, and Scandinavia. Around this same time, genetic analysis shows that another wave of sheep came out of the Fertile Crescent. These new, improved sheep had been developed with wool in mind and helped shape the vast majority of modern-day breeds. This second generation of migrant sheep spread from the Middle East into Europe, Africa, and the rest of Asia, breeding, interbreeding, and changing as they went. Interestingly, the flow of new, improved sheep didn't just go one way. Herders in North China and Mongolia, for example, developed their own unique and successful breeds, which then trotted back to Western Asia and into Europe over thousands of years via trade routes, war, and conquest. Warriors of Genghis Khan's terrifying Mongol hordes, for example, were said to have ridden west with live sheep strapped to their horses. It's interesting to note that the wild species of sheep that had entered North America via the land bridge that once linked Russia and Alaska during the last ice age were never domesticated by indigenous tribes. America had to wait until the early 16th century until it saw a domesticated sheep, when Spanish conquistadors brought over the churro. Quite how humans managed to create sheep with thick, soft wool is still a bit of a mystery. Most textile historians would agree that the woolly sheep wasn't invented in a great eureka moment, but would have been arrived at slowly through a series of experiments and accidental mutations. Farmers may have noticed that one particular sheep had an especially fluffy undercoat of wool, or less outer hair than normal, and wondered about the possibilities for fabric and clothing. Once the usefulness of wool was understood, farmers could then speed up the process by selective breeding. People had been weaving and dyeing materials for thousands of years before wool came along. The earliest evidence for both crafts goes back a staggering 30,000 years. But our prehistoric crafters would have been using plant fibres, such as flax, rather than soft, squishable wool. Imagine then how exciting it must have been when people suddenly realised the enormous potential of wool. For archaeologists, however, trying to unravel the history of wool is unenviably difficult. Ancient threads so rarely survive down through the centuries. The few scraps that have been found, however, are thrilling because they give us an anchor, a point in time when we can say with conviction that wool had arrived. One of the earliest comes from a dusty site in eastern Iran near the Afghan border called Shari Sokhta. 5,000 years ago, this forbidding, hot territory was a cultural oasis, a city with grand palaces, early writing, pottery and metalcraft, and, most significantly, a thriving textile industry. Over the years, archaeologists have uncovered piles upon piles of spindle whorls used for spinning, as well as well-preserved scraps of woolen textiles from at least 8 different types of fleece. By the end of the 3rd millennium BC, ancient records uncovered in Iraq at Ur, one of the world's very first cities, describe at least 5 categories of wool, with the finest destined, of course, for the royal wardrobe. The texts also describe shepherds controlling vast flocks of sheep, sometimes as many as 27,000 animals in one group, and, for the first time, talk of white sheep. White wool would have been rare and highly prized, a radical departure from the common brown, piebald and black fleeces that usually made up the flocks. Sheep wool had clearly become a valuable commodity, 4 times the price of goat hair, and a source of tax revenue for the royal palaces. Laws sprang up to protect sheep farmers and wool merchants from unscrupulous buyers and sheep thieves. Sheep were now worth much more alive than dead.